Welcome back to part 2 of our double episode about the life and literature of working class writer Jack Hilton. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we suggest you go back and listen to that one first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we start, just a quick note to say that we're only able to continue making these podcasts, both working class history and working class literature, because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. If you like what we do and want to help us with our work, join us on patreon.com/workingclasshistory, where you can get benefits like early access to episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted books, merch, and more. For instance, Patreon supporters got early access to both episodes about Jack Hilton, and get exclusive access to a Patreon-only bonus episode. They also get access to 2 series of Patreon-only bonus content, Radical Reads and Fireside Chat. Link in the show notes.
You have unread texts from Golf Buds. Would you like me to read them?
Yes.
Okay. Johnny says, what are the nicotine pouches you had on the course? Walker says, 8 milligram on nicotine pouches. Billy says, I love the mint one.
I like that one.
Walker says, me too. By the way, you both stink at golf. LOLOL.
Come on. Carry on nicotine pouches. Shop now at onnicotine.com/group text. Warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical.
As we mentioned in part 1, Jack Hilton's experience of long-term unemployment was all too common during the Great Depression in Britain. But out of that mass experience of unemployment, and in part because of the extra time that unemployment allowed, came a huge upsurge in writing not just about working class people, but actually by them, recounting their experiences of both work and worklessness, as well as their hopes for change. The result was that the 1930s was an extremely rich decade for working class literature, arguably even the high point in the history of British working class writing. Caliban Shrieks was very much a part of this literary moment. Here, Jack Chadwick, who we spoke to in part 1 and whose tireless efforts brought Caliban Shrieks back into print, reads a passage from Hilton's text on the effects of hard work on working class minds and bodies.
Most of my mates have uneventfully fallen into the way of working for their living. Most of them greet me and seem proud of their lot. They think they can perform the function of his favourite recreation of the working class better than their fellows. I can eat the bloody job is a common expression. Beastly blondes of toil, willing, eagers, eaters up of production. To me they are overdoing it. I think they work too hard and think too little, but they know they are good ones at it, and work never killed anyone, not hard work. Even working men do at times die. The stimulus to existence is work. It is life's sole purpose. Work for a decent wage if possible, but work certainly. For regularity and plenty of it hard, many are prepared to do it under the odds. Of course they thought the work game would go on forever. Rationalisation has now made their services less important, thank goodness. Poor cattle, full of pomposity when adorned in a new suit of Montague Burton's. Tailor-made. What tailor could meet their slender purses and yet hide the fact that they are toilers? Where is their poise, straightness, carriage? Where is their elasticity of heel? What collar could rest unwrinkled when their bony collarbones stick out so generously? How can one's head sit graciously when the nape of the vertebrae aches with jaded exhaustion? Such is the price of eating the bloody job. What mental recreation is acceptable to the fatigued body? None. Only the artificial manufactured kind. Horseology, cardology, beerology and sexology. Man is the creature of conditions, environment. If the brute is overworked, he generally cannot think. What must be done for him by Edgar Wallace, Winelot and the Bow Street Reporter? Of course this is for the good. What is nicer than hewing wood and drawing water to the thoughts of what's going to win the 230, or, yes, he has to hang by the neck until dead. Possible fortune on the one hand, and glorious better than he on the other.
In this passage, Hilton aims his trademark sarcasm at the cult of hard work under capitalism. But what's interesting here is that he's directing that sarcasm at other working class people, specifically those workers who pride themselves on their hard work, on their ability to, as he says, eat the bloody job. Work is life's sole purpose, jokes Hilton. So work for a decent wage if possible, but work certainly. Hilton is being sarcastic here because his fellow workers' belief in hard work for its own sake is actually damaging to themselves, not just because of their bony collarbones or how their vertebrae ache, but because of how overwork exhausts the mind. Again, Hilton's working class background is so important here because a passage like this by an upper class writer would risk being condescending. Hilton, meanwhile, strikes a fine balance between concern for his fellow workers but also frustration with them, precisely because he shares their experiences. The period that Hilton was writing in saw a huge interest in working class writing as publishers and literary journals increasingly wanted to document the experiences of the Great Depression. This was one of the most productive periods in British working class literary history, so there are far too many authors and novels from this period to mention here, but two of the most famous working class novels from the 1930s were Love on the Dole and Means Test Man. Love on the Dole depicts the effects of unemployment on a young working class couple in depression-hit northwest England. It was probably the most successful working class novel from the period, being reissued 10 times between 1934 and 1937. On the other hand, Means Test Man was written by out-of-work Derbyshire coal miner Walter Brierley and follows an unemployed miner and his wife in the week leading up to their invasive means test inspection. We go into a bit more detail about the means test and how it worked in part 1. Both Love on the Dole and Means Test Man are what's known as realist novels in that they attempt to depict reality quote-unquote as it is, making sure to accurately describe the details of the external world, what the characters look and sound like, etc. But perhaps because of its origin as Hilton's substitute for speechwriting, which we discussed in part 1, Caliban Shrieks is very different from both these novels.
Really, with the other sort of quite well-known working class texts from this period, like Love on the Dole and Means Test Man, he was so removed from the styles of these texts and the sort of way they're structured. The fact that he never set out to be a writer meant that he wasn't oblivious to how these texts were being written, but he just didn't care because he wasn't writing to fit into any mold. He wasn't even if you're not conscious of it, if you're trying to write something that with the idea of it getting published and read, even if you're not conscious of the fact that you're doing this, you are still going to be writing it with these norms in mind. So like Walter Greenwood's Love on the Dole would have been written with the idea of it having the kind of structure that it ended up having, even if Greenwood wasn't exactly like, I'm going to write this and it's going to tick all these boxes or whatever. Hilton just did not have any kind of sense of needing to tick off certain rules of what constitutes a good piece of prose when he was writing his own masterpiece. And I think because the rough draft of Caliban Shrieks, or what would become Caliban Shrieks, made it to literary people and publishers before Hilton even knew that he could publish it, it meant that they then encouraged him to keep going with his eccentricities and with the things that defined his debut novel as completely uncategorizable. So I think that the main point is that there's just nothing to compare Hilton to, or if there is, I think there probably is, but it's completely buried and completely forgotten and lost. I mean, I wonder how many other private journals remained private journals from this period and from afterwards and from before. There's probably scores of them that just never had the good luck to have the sort of a fluke exposure that Hilton had. And maybe the only texts that would ever have any kind of similarity to Hilton's are those ones, people's private diaries and journals. He wasn't writing to be read, he just didn't care. And by the time that his writing had been discovered, the fact that it was so formless, or it had its own form, and that this was something that made it so special to the people that, got their hands on it. And the encouragement from these people was then emphasizing the uniqueness of Hilton's prose. So Hilton never had to really fit inside any of the, the accepted rules of writing. And he was, before he even knew it, he was being celebrated for flouting these rules. And certainly I think, his editors would have had a hard time because although, he taught himself how to write, in the face, it's undoubtedly the case that his prose at that point would have been probably quite hard to read, in the sense that it would have been, if you read some of his letters and stuff, correspondence, even from the late 30s, there's like, it's sort of like his punctuation and like spelling and stuff. It's like you can understand it, but it's far more, it's vernacular Lancastrian. And I think his editors tried to keep as much of it as possible, but still had to sort of put a bit of a straitjacket on his writing.
However, Hilton was not always happy to receive this kind of straitjacket from his editors. A few years after Caliban Shrieks was published, one of Hilton's stories was due to appear in the literary journal New Writing, but he pulled it when he found out he'd gotten a book deal elsewhere. In a letter to friend and fellow working class author Jack Common, Hilton explained that he didn't want what he referred to as the New Writing editor's amendments and cuttings. Quote, "He takes the bloody life out of a job. These pups of university boys with a flary flair for lit in the worst form are too dictatorially important." End quote. In another letter to Common, Hilton explains how he was determined to, quote, "break through the independence of this lot of little big men, these silver spoon progressive editors." End quote.
I don't want anyone to get the impression from what I've said that Hilton didn't know what he should be doing with Caliban Shrieks, because, like I say, he'd read hundreds and hundreds of novels from the English canon, and including like modernist texts like Lawrence's Sons and Lovers. He'd read it all, and so he would have had an idea of what a novel should have been in the eyes of like the people that at the time held the purse strings of publishers. But so many people, even critics nowadays, responding to Caliban Shrieks, have this tendency to view what Hilton does as being just either completely accidental or just not giving him the credit that is due for the effects that his book has. It's almost like, it's just a happy accident that it has this stirring effect, and that he takes you on this emotional journey.
Indeed, Hilton was well acquainted with the works of the literary canon, not to mention its various techniques and motifs, as shown in this next passage that Jack is about to read out.
The lily-painted descriptions of nature by an artist in a throes of hypnotic rapture is but the expression of the dualism of being well-fed and ideally imaginative. The Grecians with their culture belonged to the well-fed minority, while their slave brethren were more or less inexpressive. So it is that we paint pictures according to our stage of evolution. Well-fedness is the objective stimulus for the nice abstract words or canvas painting. A hungry man has a hungry outlook, and little or no interest in the noctambulist wool gatherings of a nature devotee who raves away, you know how, a sky of silken blue stuccoed with the golden riplets of sunny tints, above hills of green-brown majesty. Oh, the muck of metaphor, how you kid the soft highfalutin hungering shop assistants with such stuff, and send them on their Sunday hikes with those back-to-nature rucksacks. To the hobo, the sky is hardly ever noticed unless it is to be seen whether it offers mildness or storm. Pleasant scenery is totally ignored. Only nature in dithyrambic humour is worthy of concern, and only because of its possibility of discomfort. The miles are long and weary. They lead uninterestingly from one town to another. Man must have some purpose. Walking from one town to another is for tramps.
There's a biting cynicism here which seems aimed at the writings of romantic nature poetry or Victorian landscape painters, which he calls noctambulist wool gatherings, that is, the pointless daydreams of a sleepwalker basically. Hilton mocks their descriptions of silken blue skies and stuccoed sunny tints, saying that they're of no interest to the hobo, which Hilton was for about a decade, as we discussed in part 1. The hobo's relationship to nature and the sky is entirely practical. Will it rain? Will I be able to walk for miles or sleep outside comfortably? In stark contrast to the scenes of nature poets or painters then, Hilton writes that the hobo's paths are long and weary and lead uninterestingly from one town to another. But this contrast is not necessarily a total rejection of the literary canon. As mentioned previously, Hilton frequently quotes Shakespeare in his novel, and in this passage itself, he even drops little mentions of the ancient Greeks, like his comments about Grecian culture belonging to a well-fed minority and nature's dithyrambic humour, with the dithyramb being an ancient Greek form of choral song or poem. So while it might seem at first that Hilton's point is that literary tradition is of no interest to the poor, on closer inspection it's more that the conditions of the poor detach them from literary tradition. Hilton's mockery of that tradition while drawing on parts of it can be read as another example of his attempt to seize it for the working class. As much as it's a comment about bourgeois literature, it's also a comment about what society does both to the poor and to culture, and how that might be different if only everyone was well fed. The success of Caliban Shrieks opened up new opportunities for Jack Hilton.
After Caliban Shrieks was met with critical acclaim, and favourable reviews from the likes of Orwell and Auden and the rest of sort of modernist circle around Philadelphia, it gave Hilton this confidence to pursue writing, even though he'd never in his entire life thought that he could one day do this. He'd never thought of himself as ever having the ability to make money from his expression. He'd only ever thought of his expression as being potentially useful in getting a better quality of life for his class. But he took the opportunity presented by the success of Caliban Shrieks to go and study at Ruskin College, and he studied there. And I've not been able to find exactly what he studied, but it would have been, I think, quite an all-encompassing course, maybe involving, politics, economics, literature.
Ruskin College was set up in 1899 with the aim of providing education to the working classes. The college received funding from trade unions and sympathetic wealthy benefactors, and provided working people with the opportunity to do long-distance and evening courses. However, its main function was as a residential college where working class people could live and study for a minimal price, with many attending on scholarships. Over the next few years, Hilton would publish 2 more novels, Champion in 1938 and Laugh at Polonius in 1942.
Both of these are fantastically written demonstrations of his ability to write a very neat novel that gets across working class life in a really powerful way. But they weren't really, I don't think, the kind of things that he wanted to write. And by this point, there was just this general turn away from working class writers on the part of publishing houses. And it became more and more of an uphill struggle. And it had always been steep, but it became almost vertical struggle to get publishers to pay any mind to people like Hilton. Even though he did have, the assistance of people with big profiles, of more respected writers like Orwell. And in the case of Orwell, he received a lot of help, particularly into the 40s. And this help was, I think, really, it's quite fair to say that Orwell gave more support, more concrete help to Jack Hilton than he gave to any other writer in his life. And this, it took the shape of, in, I think, 1945, the two, after, a break in their correspondence because of the war, because of Orwell's illnesses, and just in general because of, they'd both been busy with other things. Hilton had been doing something for the war effort, I think, working in to put out fires. They got back in touch with each other, and Hilton asked Orwell for help with moving forward with the kinds of things he wanted to write. And Orwell not only put in a good word for Hilton with his publisher, Jonathan Cape, but he invited Hilton to come and take tea with him in his flat in Islington, which was incredibly rare. Orwell did this with only maybe less than a handful of other people, invited him around for tea and then went to a pub with him. He was a very guarded private man. And so was Jack Hilton. I'm really intrigued by what the dynamic between Orwell and Hilton would have been like. I think, because Orwell was a listener as well, I think it was really unusual because with Hilton, Orwell was in the position of actually having to talk, which is another really quirky thing about their relationship, was that from the accounts of their meetings, I think both of them sort of had to sort of talk more than either of them were used to with each other, because otherwise it would have been silence and black pudding. The lengths that Orwell went to support Hilton are really remarkable. He even, after negotiating on his behalf with Jonathan Cape, he even came with Hilton to meet the bearer of bad news from the publisher, in which, Hilton found out that he wouldn't be commissioned to write the kinds of books that he really wants to write.
Indeed, Orwell arranged a dinner for Hilton with Veronica Wedgwood, a reader for the publisher Jonathan Cape, who had already published some of Hilton's work. Orwell and Hilton's hope was that Wedgwood might be able to secure a 3-book contract for Hilton, which would give him the kind of longer-term financial stability to be able to leave his plastering job and pursue a career in writing. However, as Jack mentioned, the tide was turning against working-class literature, with Wedgwood herself writing an internal memo at Jonathan Cape saying that, quote, "the proletarian novel, in my opinion, is finished completely," end quote. Before this, however, Hilton also experimented with another literary genre, the travelogue.
One of the sort of other forms of writing that he sort of thought he could play a lot with and develop in the same way as he did with his prose in Caliban Shrieks was the sort of the form of a travelogue. I think my second favourite of his books is English Ways. It's a sort of dare I say, a satire, or sort of it takes the popular format of the travelogue, which is really probably the most sold books of the time, were these travelogues about traipsing up and down the English countryside, quite quaint narrations of these journeys by upper middle class writers. And Hilton, took this format and turned it on its head by using it as a way to talk about different working class communities across the country, and exploring the people of these communities and the types of people in these places. And he was the only person who wrote a travelogue to start in the north of England. All the others start either in London or in places just on the outskirts.
As Jack mentioned, English Ways is fundamentally satirical in tone. But, as some have pointed out, Hilton's travelogue seems to be a satire specifically directed at George Orwell. The writer Andy Croft argues that English Ways can be read as an answer to The Road to Wigan Pier, while literary scholar Ben Clark points out that while Hilton doesn't mention Orwell by name, he does mention, quote, a bestseller from a middle-class socialist who was at particular pains to stress the acuteness of his sense of smell and insisted that working men stank, end quote.
So he wrote English Ways, and then first time, and 10 years later, English Ribbon. And they're quite cocky and quite cheeky. And I think there's more of a sort of humour, and there's certainly less bleakness and tragedy in these texts. But they are nonetheless really special for the way that Hilton's found his voice. And it is the voice of the same Caliban, of 1934. But Caliban after Prospero's Island, really. Caliban all wants, he's got full mastery of himself, really. And it's really terrible that the publishers didn't jump on these books and really back them in a way that would have got Hilton a proper lifelong literary career. Especially because after the refusal to give him a kind of contract that would guarantee him a good quality of life in writing, after that refusal, he sort of gave up, and within 5 years, after English Ribbon, he sort of just gave up on the idea of being a full-time writer, because he realised that to do it, to sort of get those kinds of contracts where he wouldn't have to go begging back after writing each book, where he'd have the sort of guarantee of stable work. To do that, he'd have to really censor himself in a way. The garbling effects of mortgage respectability, he would have to really sort of change his tone and write differently. And he never wanted to do that. His voice and its rootedness in his status as a manual proletarian, as a worker from Rochdale, from the north, so far outside of London, it was more important to him to keep that than to be paid for writing more, I guess the word is tasteful, more tasteful, as in a sense of works that were more sort of in keeping with the taste of the people who held the purse strings. So he chose to stop trying to get his writing published. He kept on writing throughout his life. Unfortunately, a lot of what he wrote has been lost.
This really highlights a common theme in the production of working class writing. That is, that beyond the struggle to find time between long working hours to actually write, and even after the struggle to actually get published, is the struggle for that work to actually be remembered and valued. As Jack mentioned in part 1, Hilton was celebrated by some of the biggest writers of his time, thought of as possibly the next D.H. Lawrence. That a working class author as appreciated as Hilton could be forced to drop out of writing and then fall immediately into almost total obscurity really demonstrates just how easy it is to lose such authors. And Hilton would have been lost, possibly forever, had it not been for Jack's determination and what, it has to be said, was quite an amazing series of lucky events.
I'd sort of given up on finding anything more I could about Jack Hilton. So after reading Caliban Shrieks in the Working Class Movement Library in Salford, I was just desperate to find out whatever I could about him and sort of finish his story, find out what had happened to this man. After he's taken you through this psychic tour of his first 35 years, you're just left with this desperate feeling of wanting to know more. And so I set about doing the typical things of Googling. I even used Ask Jeeves. I was desperate. I was trying to think of whatever I could to try and find out whatever I could. I spoke to the librarian, and she only added fuel to this fire She just was able to tell me that he'd mysteriously left writing for reasons that no one that she knew could really speak to. I even went on ancestry.co.uk to try and sort of like find out more about his family, to see if any of them would, still be alive, still know anything about what happened to Jack. That, got me nowhere at all. The last thing that I could think to do was, after finding out that he died in Chadderton in Oldham in 1984, finding his death certificate, I can't remember if it was his death certificate, or I found some kind of proof that he died in Oldham in 1984. And so I went, as a last-ditch effort, I went to what would have been his old locals. I think I set off with the intention of going to like 4 pubs. So they were still standing from when he would have lived there in the late 70s and early 80s. So I went around these pubs with a poster that I'd printed out that had the only picture I could find of him printed on it with, in big letters, "Do you remember Jack Hilton?" or something to that effect. And then at the bottom, it'll like tear off tassels with my number, asking people to get in touch if they even had any vague recollections of this man. And it was I went around 2 pubs, put up these posters, had a pint, and I was continuing going down this bus route towards Chadderton. Then in the 3rd pub, I go in and I start talking. The 2 pubs before, no one had been that interested in what I was doing, so I've been in and out after my pint. But in the 3rd pub, the last behind the bar was really interested, and so I started talking to her about it, and I think she just thinks I'm a little bit mad. But then from like the bar's got like columns along it, and from behind this column, so out of sight to me, but not to the barmaid, was like a woman who must have been like in her 70s, late 70s maybe, who had been basically just eavesdropping on my conversation with the barmaid. And she, after about like 5 minutes, she just popped up, like sticked her head forward so that I could see her, and was like, "Oh, you know what, love? I think I might know who you're on about." And basically, she had only she'd been drinking in the pub for decades and decades, from the time of Hilton, but she'd only the vaguest memories of Jack. But she could tell me a lot about Jack's best friend, a guy called Brian. He was much younger than Jack and had gone on drinking the same pub for, about 30 years more. He'd, in fact, only died the year before I went to visit this pub, his old local. So she was able to give me Brian's name and tell me that, he used to hang around with this kind old man, Jack Hilton, who was dead quiet. He used to come sit in a pub. There was 3 of them, she said. There was Brian, there was another bloke whose name she forgot, and then there was Jack, and they used to just keep themselves to themselves. But she was able to tell me Brian's full name. I looked up immediately. I tried to find anything I could, and an old Yellow Pages had his address as listed as being just around the corner from the pub. So I went and I knocked on, and I had no response on the knock. So there's no cars in my drive. So I thought, you know what, it's pissing down with rain. So I felt, this might be. I got excited, but probably it's not going to lead to anything. But I thought, you know what, I've got these posters with me, and just pure luck, I had a biro on me, so I put a note through the door. And one thing I've said since is, I never was the kind of person to carry pen and paper around with me until that date. But ever since I realised, that basically the rediscovery of Hilton rested on the fact that I had a biro on me that day, I've always carried one with me since. And I'd left my email and my phone number. About a week later, I got an email back from a woman called Mary Hassel, who was Brian's widow, informing me that Brian had passed away, but that she remembered Jack, dear old Jack, as she called him, who used to come over for his tea at her and Brian's house several times a week, especially after Jack's wife had died, and he was on his own. He was sort of like a surrogate grandfather to her 2 kids. And so she invited me over for a cup of tea and some custard tarts. And I went over, and, we talked for hours about Jack. And as we're talking, more and more memories are coming back. I go around again. We keep talking. I'm recording and I'm writing everything I can about her memories of Jack. And then, one time she tells me this story about how when the kids were bored, he could blow smoke rings. He was a chain smoker, and he could blow smoke rings with his pipe, which would do the trick most of the time to entertain the kids. But if they were being particularly rowdy, Hilton had another party trick up his sleeve, which was that he could blow smoke through his ears. And at first, when Mary told me this, I was just like, what, are you sure? Because I'd never heard of this before in my life. And I looked into it. I actually got in touch with a friend of mine who's a GP. The strangest request for medical advice I think this mate of mine's ever received in his life. I was like, would it ever be possible for someone to blow smoke through their ears? And he told me, yeah, but only if you've had severe damage to your ears. The kind of damage that could, in the case of Hilton, it could have come from the mill machinery when he was 11, working the cotton mill in Rochdale. Could have come from the trenches. Could have even come from like breaking rocks in the poorhouses in the 1920s. So this was, one of the tricks he would do to keep the kids amused.
The fact that Hilton could take what were likely perforated eardrums that he'd gotten from one or another of the traumatic experiences that he'd lived through and use them for the entertainment of others is, in a way, a miniature version of what he did with Caliban Shrieks. Mary also told Jack about Hilton's pet budgie, which in its own way led indirectly to the republishing of Caliban Shrieks.
When he passed away, as his best mate Brian, was at his deathbed, and Brian and Mary agreed to take on the sort of efforts of like organising a funeral and clearing out his flat. And they also decided to adopt Hilton's budgie. They brought it into their house, and within a day or so, the budgie was at death's door, and then it just died. And now the reason, according to the vet, Mary told me that it just passed away after Jack's death, was that it was suffering from nicotine withdrawal because he was such a heavy smoker, and the budgie had been just used to being absolutely just hotboxed with nicotine all of its waking life. But, a day or two without it was such a stress on its little anatomy that it packed itself in. But that made me think, what else had Brian and Mary been left by Jack Hilton? And so, using information from Mary, I was able to track down his probate. And the probate he was small. He had very little when he died. He'd left most of it to Mary. And, as you get with probates, at the end of it, you have a clause where it's like, and anything not named in this last will and testament goes to, and in this case, the everything else goes to clause was to Brian. So without ever knowing that Jack had been a writer, Brian Hassel, his mate, had inherited all of the literary rights to his collected works. And then Mary, again without ever knowing that Brian had the rights to Jack's work, or that Jack had ever been a writer, then inherited the author's rights to his writings when Brian passed away. And so after realising this, I told Mary about it and said, but this is fantastic because this means that we can get Hilton back in print potentially, if we can make the case to publishers and get someone interested. At that point, I thought, the best case scenario would be getting a small independent publisher to maybe do a small run of a few hundred or something, or potentially, if that wasn't possible, we could maybe raise some money to get some copies self-published. So I had no idea that it would ever end up with a publisher, the world's largest literary publisher, Penguin. And Mary was thrilled, but she said, "You know what, Jack? It sounds like a lot of work, and the kind of work that really it should be for you to do." And so she said, "I don't know how to do this exactly, but I'll sign over whatever these rights are to you on the proviso that you do your utmost to get Hilton back in print." And that's what happened. We ended up looking up, how to do this, and found a Google template we had to look up what exactly a literary right was, and look up how to do like transfers and stuff like that. And then I ended up with the rights, and then I started to turn the story of my discovery of Hilton and my, feelings about what I found, and then the story of finding Mary and reminiscing about Jack. I started to turn that into an article for a small, independent, Manchester-based magazine called The Mill. But then, when it was eventually published a few months after I first met Mary, it had the most amazing response, and became one of the outlet's best read ever pieces. And it caught the ear, or the eyes rather, of people working at various media outlets. So within a couple of months of that, I was on Times Radio, BBC Six Music, even I was in national print, The Independent, The Guardian, and then it all culminated in being invited for a segment on BBC Front Row. Now, of all the people listening to that segment, there was one bloke, Nick, who was publishing director of vintage classics and imprint of Penguin books. And he was listening to this segment, that 15-minute long segment, waiting for the good news at the end to be. And so Hilton's Caliban Shrieks will be republished with, X publisher. But by that point, I had no idea how to approach publishers, and I had no idea what it would take to get the book back in print. And so there was no deal done. So Nick was listening to this segment on Front Row, waiting for the good news story. And then, to his utter disbelief, there was no, and then the book will be brought back out with blah, 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 in so-and-so time period. So he found me on Twitter and he sent me a direct message. And then we had a conversation on the phone. He was on paternity leave. So he ducked out of paternity leave to basically say, let's go ahead. Let's try to get this brought out with vintage. And that's what happened. Within a few months, it was all agreed. And then about a year and a half later, here we are with the book out, and with a response to its publication that I could never have ever imagined. It became the number one seller for vintage and entered the top 100s on Amazon, and has sold incredibly well. It cleared 10,000 copies. I don't think Hilton could ever have imagined. I don't exactly know how many were printed in the 30s, but my suspicion is that it was only, in the hundreds. So to say that his legacy is exploded now, 90 years after the book was first published, is an understatement.
Finally then, Jack Hilton is getting the recognition he so richly deserves. But as Jack points out, while Hilton absolutely should be remembered for the excellent writing that he left behind, his legacy also needs to be thought of in relation to his trade union activity outside of his writing.
He never saw himself as a writer, and he loved the work of plastering so much, and he loved by this point after the war, it was a decent pay that he got from plastering. It was enough to have quite a decent life by his standards, at least. So he kept to it, and he loved the union work. He loved the fact that this craft gave him an opportunity to better the lives of working class people through the strengthening of the establishment of the union in the Northwest. We talk about the legacy of Jack Hilton, and I think if you were to talk to Jack Hilton about his legacy, for him, this sort of new look at his books, which were never popular back in the 30s and 40s, were never that well read, the credit that he's being given now and the celebration of him now is an important part of his legacy, but no less important to me or to him or to the people that his life touched is his work in the trade union movement. And the fact that, he was a plasterer who was proud of his work. He founded the Rochdale branch of the Plasterers Union and was its first president. And I believe potentially also this branch was, integral to forming the wider sort of Lancastrian chapter of the Plasterers Union. And Hilton was involved in and senior in the regional sort of union structure until I think 1955. And he was proud not only of the work that he did as a plasterer and the buildings that he beautified and the frescoes and stuccos that he was able to do in these big houses across Greater Manchester, but he's also proud of the fact that he passed on not only these skills to younger workers, but he also founded these branches that won better lives for their members. And if you want to look for a material legacy for Jack Hilton, it is in the better lives that his union branches left for his workers. And that's just as important a legacy as his writing.
Oh, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.
That's it for this double episode on the life and work of working class author Jack Hilton. We also have a bonus episode where our interviewee Jack Chadwick reads and discusses more passages from Caliban Shrieks. That bonus episode will be available soon, exclusively for our supporters on Patreon. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch, and more. And if you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Nick Williams, and Old Norm. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed these episodes, and thanks for listening.